Today we're going to talk about revolutions. Revolutions in the sense of the colonies seeking to start a new independent government for themselves and breaking away from European control. First up is the American Revolution. The American Revolution had many causes that started it. But basically, one of the biggest ones was Enlightenment, which we've covered recently. And Enlightenment was when the people wanted to base their government off of principles such as the social contract, valuing people's rights, representative government, or at least a government that did not have absolute control over society. Now, the American Revolution started in the 13 colonies, which you see right here. These are 13 British colonies, and one of the biggest things that contributed to the war the revolution was the 7 Years' War, where France and England fought over this territory. Now, here's France's territory, and here is England's territory, or now Great Britain. And they fought over all this territory in between. And when they were doing that, England won a significant territory in North America. Now, the government of England, the King of England, thought that the colonies should help pay for this war, for the supplies that they had during the war. But the colonists thought that their service in the war was good enough. So they didn't like being taxed, which is what the government did. The king imposed several taxes on them, the Revenue Act, the Stamp Act, and the Tea Act, all of which they did without representation in the English Parliament. This made the colonists very mad. Another thing that made them mad was that Great Britain stationed troops in the colonies after the war to sort of keep an eye out on them and make sure that they're doing the right thing. So eventually, a guy named Thomas Paine wrote a book called Common Sense. And in this pamphlet, Thomas Paine basically encouraged the colonists to form an independent government, separate from the European government and based on Enlightenment principles. He thought that this would be better. And then the leaders in the colonies got together and wrote the Declaration of Independence, which was a document that they signed declaring them independent from Europe, that they were going to be a separate country from Europe. And it also stated a lot of the problems they had with European control. And so after the Declaration of Independence signed, the war begins, the American Revolution, and where the colonists go to war with Great Britain. But the colonists are not doing very well. They actually are losing quite badly to the British until France comes in and helps them out. France wanted to get back at Great Britain because of all the battles, the long history of conflict between England and France. And so they come back in and they actually help the colonists to sort of spite Great Britain. So once with the colonies win independence with the help of France, they write the U.S. Constitution. And the U.S. Constitution outlines the structure of the government. Now, this was not the first Constitution. They started out with something called the Articles of Confederation. But people couldn't really agree on the Articles of Confederation, and so they threw that one out, wrote the new Constitution. And this was based on several different principles, all of which kind of came from Enlightenment ideas. The first one is representative democracy, which also was heavily influenced by Greek and Roman models as well. That they had 3 branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And they all share power, and they can sort of make sure that nobody has too much power. And this is called checks and balances, when they can sort of talk or sort of control each other so that they're not oppressing the people's rights. They also had separation of church and state, which is did not allow things like divine right to occur, where people said that they were chosen by God to be leaders. And they also wrote the Bill of Rights, added that onto the Constitution so that the government could not take control or take people's rights away from them. In France, there was also a revolution, but in France, the revolution was not of a colony trying to break away from France. It was of the French people who wanted changes in their government. Now, King Louis was in control at the time, and he was the absolute monarch. He lived a very luxurious lifestyle, as you can see in this picture up here. This is King Louis, and especially his wife Marie Antoinette was very famous for spending money as well. But King Louis wasn't actually that bad of a king. He actually respected the people's rights and tried to help them in a lot of ways. But he had one big problem. He needed to pay off war debts. France had been involved in many, many wars in Europe, fought a lot, helped the colonies in America revolt against the British, and so he needed to raise taxes so that he could pay off the debts. And so he called together the French Parliament, the Estates General, so that he could actually raise those taxes. He wanted to get their input. And so the Estates General consisted of three classes. The first is the clergy, the religious officials. The second one is the nobles, which would have inherited land it's sort of from that feudal system. And the last one is the commoners, which was 95% of the population. Now, the Third Estate, when they got together, did not feel like they were actually being listened to. And in actuality, the Estates General did raise taxes, and it was the Third Estate that was responsible for paying most of those increased taxes. So, in the end, they were not very happy with what happened. And so the Estates General actually attacks the other two estates, and they take over France, and now they're going to call themselves the National Assembly. They write something called the Declaration of Rights of Man, and this is basically what they thought every human being was entitled to, things that the government could not take away from them, these unalienable rights. And when they attacked them, they also captured King Louis the 16th, and they beheaded him, as you can see here, after a long sort of bloody battle over to take over France. And they wrote 4 different constitutions, each of which was thrown out because they could not agree on how the government of France should actually be set up. And so there was a lot of fighting in France. All this fighting was because nobody could agree. Each political party had a different idea of how the government should be, and they constantly fought over it. So eventually, there was something called the Committee of Public Safety that was created to restore order and to protect people's rights. And this sounds really great, but what actually happened is they had a reign of terror. They did a lot of beheadings, as you can see here with the guillotine. They would basically capture anybody who they suspected of going against the Committee of Public Safety and kill them in public to get people in line and following the government so that this revolution could actually have some success. But in the end, they were actually sort of taking away people's rights that they were fighting for. Now, revolutions in Latin America, there are actually a bunch of them that are sort of, we're going to all talk about shortly, and then we'll kind of get back to them, and the French Revolution, the American Revolution, what happened after them later on. But in Latin America, the natives were decimated by slavery and by diseases. They also brought Africans over to replace those Native Americans as slaves on the haciendas and plantations. And so these people did not have their rights respected. And as Enlightenment spread, these sort of things are going to stand out. Also, in the encomienda system, the Creoles were not respected either. These were Spanish-born, or people born to Spanish parents in the Americas. So even though they had Spanish descent, they were not respected because they were not born in Spain. And so the Creoles are actually some of the ones that start and instigate a lot of these revolutions. Now, Latin America was also had not a very good economy. They had cash crops, growing monocultures or minings, but this gave all the wealth into the hands of a few. Also, because it was a monoculture based, if whatever they were selling, if being sugar or tobacco, if the demand for that went down, then that means their economy would basically collapse. Another problem was the United Fruit Company, which was a large trading company, merchant, that was responsible for taking most of the goods and selling them in Europe. And they sort of monopolized trade and control these colonies. So, one thing that helped Latin America in their revolutions was that Spain and Portugal were busy defending their countries against Napoleon. Napoleon was a French almost king, which we'll talk about in the next lesson, and he was trying to conquer all of Europe, and so they were spending their time defending themselves rather than trying to control the colonies. They were also influenced by Enlightenment, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution. They were also inspired by Maroon societies, which were groups of runaway slaves that would often go back to the plantations and try to help more slaves escape and earn some sort of freedom. So the first revolution was actually in Haiti, which is a Caribbean island. And in Haiti, the 90% of the population were African slaves that were brought over to grow coffee and sugar and indigo and plantations. And they were brutally treated because the population of slaves was so high. The plantation owners had to treat them bad to keep them in fear of them so that they wouldn't revolt. But it didn't actually work out for them because there was a slave revolt led by this guy, Pierre Toussaint L'Ouverture. And he led one of the only successful slave revolts in history, where they actually took over and made Haiti an independent country. In Brazil, Brazil was not, even though it says revolution in Brazil, was not so revolutionary. While Portugal was fighting Napoleon in Europe, the Portuguese king basically just gave Brazil to his son, Pedro II. And Pedro II established an independent country after it was given to him by his father and created a constitutional monarchy where he tried to make several enlightened changes. He was an enlightened despot. He tried to free the slaves and change the class divisions, which got him in trouble in the end. We'll talk about in the next lesson. Also in South America, Simón Bolívar writes the Jamaica Letter to try to encourage people to seek independence. And he also leads an army to conquer what's called Grand Colombia. You can kind of see this territory back behind Simón here. And once he conquers this territory, he joins up with Jose San Martin and to kick the Spanish out of South America completely. The last revolution is in Mexico, and the revolution was started by a Catholic priest named Miguel Hidalgo. And the Catholics were oftentimes some of the largest critics of the treatment of slaves and the just sort of society in the plantations. But because he wanted to end slavery, the landowners actually captured him during the revolution and turned him over to the Spanish, who executed him. And then the revolution had to be continued by a guy named Jose Morelos. But eventually the Spanish got tired of fighting. They were tired of spending resources. They couldn't keep control of colonies. They had lost so many already. And so they eventually just signed the Treaty of Cordoba and officially recognized Mexican independence. And this is it for Latin American revolutions. We will continue the discussion of what happened in these countries after the revolutions in the next lesson.